2010 session. I'm here on my own and not with Rob Foster. Unfortunately, Rob Foster is over in Tennessee, still in Nashville. He kind of toured America trying to get over here. I know he spent a little bit of time in Chicago, O'Hare, and so on, but his flight didn't make it. Originally, he was going to be coming to London and then Paris, and I think then Dublin or something like that, but obviously it all got cancelled. So yeah, it's just myself. How many people here listen to the SharePoint pod show? Anybody? Yeah. So you may have heard the one recently where Rob Foster was a rotten banana because he couldn't make that either. So I was thinking maybe we could go along with that theme, and you know, if you have any questions or anything like that, then we can save them up for Rob if need be. So a little bit about myself. My name's Brett Lonsdale. I'm basically work for Lightning Tools along with NixOne. We specialize in business connectivity services. Historically, I've been I've sort of spent the last 7 years, I guess, being a SharePoint developer and trainer with combined knowledge, and then a couple of years ago, I formed Lightning Tools with NixOne. I authored a book fairly recently. It's the Developer's Guide to the Business Data Catalog, 2007, and I've also contributed a couple of chapters and so on to the Admin Companion, both 2007 and also I'm contributing to the 2010 version of that. And as I mentioned, I'm also the co-host of the SharePoint Pod Show. So that's a little bit about myself. Rob, who is not here, he found this flag, which he's very proud of. Being a proud American and a redneck was the way he describes himself. So quite often you'll find Rob, when he's not working with SharePoint, he'll be barbecuing and tweeting about what he's cooking and so on and so forth. So you can always find out about his latest invention on the barbecue. So Rob, he works for Deloitte. He's a lead architect for SharePoint over there. He's a SharePoint MVP and also co-host of the Pod Show. You'll find him on Twitter as Les Paul Rob, and myself as Brett Lonsdale. And Rob was also, well, he's also a book writer. He's written SharePoint 2007 Development Unleashed, and also the ASP.NET 3.5 Ajax Unleashed as well. So the session that we're going to be doing today, we're going to be comparing different data access methods within SharePoint. BCS is going to be discussed. We're going to be talking also about custom web part development, the data viewer web part, and we'll also touch a little bit on reporting services as well. So a couple of things to start off. Initially, we need to sort of ask ourselves why we would want to connect to a line of business data and bring data into SharePoint. And then also the second question is how are you going to do that? So since it's been something we've been specializing in for a couple of years, we also get a lot of questions from our customers about how to access different data methods. We'll hopefully be able to answer most of your questions, which we can do at any point during the session. So what we've found is that most of our customers don't all use the business data catalog, or they don't all plan to use business connectivity services. They're often after an alternate way of connecting to their line of business systems. But one thing that we do know is that they're all after the same goal. Every single organization that obviously wants to display line of business data in SharePoint wants to solve some issues, such as, well, take SAP for example. How many people use SAP? Okay, just one or two. So there's people in your organization that may occasionally need to run a report off or something like that, and I believe it's very, very difficult to actually create a report in the first place that might be useful. It's very, very time consuming and so on. So you've got to go through either the training process of getting somebody up to speed with SAP so that they can go and get the reports that they want, or you've got to have expensive IT people in place to produce the reports for them so they can see how the business is running and so on. So SharePoint makes a good platform for actually displaying that line of business data in easy to read web parts is basically what the goal is. And like I say, rather than just web parts, BCS and BDC offer alternate ways as well of using that data. So through the business data column, using the search functionality and so on. So yeah, certainly one thing is providing a common user interface to the entire organization. SharePoint happens to be the central focus of many companies. We can use that platform to expose the line of business data, and then they can use that as a way of searching it and displaying the data without having to go into the back-end systems. And like I say, learning a complicated user interface, perhaps. So how can we connect to data? Well, you may be aware of inside SharePoint Designer, we have something called the Data Viewer web part. Does anybody use a Data View web part? Okay, we have a few. Excellent. So the Data View web part is certainly one option. You have many different data sources that we're going to explore. It doesn't have to be a relational database backend. You can connect directly to XML files or web services and so on. And using that, you can very quickly configure your connection to the data source, put the web part on the page, and save the changes, and all of a sudden users are able to view that data. And it offers some great functionality such as filtering and sorting and conditional formatting. You can connect these web parts together. They're very, very flexible, and they don't require any programming whatsoever, which is the beauty of them. There are some downsides to it, so what we're going to do is compare that to some of these other options as well. We also have custom web part development. Why would we do that? Well, that's what we're going to explore. How many people have written their own custom web part that actually goes and connects to a back-end database? Yeah, excellent. So quite a few people. So there's many methods that we can use to do that. Again, we're going to look at the pros and cons. One of the pros is the fact that you've got full control and you can pretty much do whatever it is you want to do to connect to that back-end source. And you know the data and everything as a developer, so you can give the users exactly what they want as well. So we'll have a look at the pros and cons of that. We're also going to explore business connectivity services. Anybody seen business connectivity services yet? Okay, a few people. Excellent. I know there's several sessions on BCS run by, obviously, myself this week, and Nick Swan and Phil Duffy. So you'll be able to get more and more knowledge about BCS as the week goes on. And then finally, we're just going to touch on reporting services. We did have a sort of guest speaker, which is Paul Cumsey. He was going to come and talk a little bit about reporting services. So I'm just going to kind of summarize that and talk about that as being one of the options that you do have available to you. So first of all, the SharePoint Designer Data Viewer web part. Obviously, you need SharePoint Designer in order for that to work. But the good news is that SharePoint Designer is free, so that's a really good start. You can connect to many different data source types as well. So like I said, it's not just a relational database. You can connect to XML. You can actually use it to connect to lists as well, and web services. One of the nice things about that is the fact that you can also link your sources together. So it might be that you've got, or you can mix and match different types of data sources. So you can perhaps take some data from your relational database and also some data from a SharePoint list and present them inside the same web part. So you get almost like a master-child thing that you can expand and collapse. So that's one of the really neat things about that. What we're going to do is just jump in and take a look at it. So what we have here from the Site Actions menu, we now have the Edit in SharePoint Designer link. So I know before in previous versions of SharePoint, we used to rely on opening up a site in SharePoint Designer using the File menu in Internet Explorer. And if you just had your SharePoint page, your web part page in edit mode, you still had the shared =1 or something like that at the end of the URL. You often had to clear that so that you could actually see the option available in Internet Explorer. So what we have here in SharePoint Designer is data sources over on the left-hand side. So we can click onto data sources, and you can see that along the top here are different data sources that we have available. So the first one being the linked data source that I discussed. We've then got the database connection. We've got the SOAP, REST, and also XML file connections that we can configure here. I'm just going to show you some of the options that are available in the database connection. So when I go to configure one of these, the one thing that you may notice in here is, well, we just basically fill in some of the properties such as the server name, and we can choose from one of two providers by default. So you've got the SQL Server provider, or you've got OLADB as two of the different options. Now, it is possible to actually go and write your own connection string as well. So if you want to connect via ODBC or something like that, I find connectionstrings.com very, very useful. You can go and grab a sample connection string and then configure that for your own connection and pop that in here. That is one way that you can also get a trusted connection. Back in SharePoint 2003, you used to have three options here for the authentication. You could pass through a username and password. If you're using SQL Server, then obviously you'd need to have that configured for mixed mode. You could also use single sign-on, or you could use a trusted authentication, which means it's just going to pass through the token of whichever user is currently logged on within your environment. And that option's gone away. The reason why it's gone away is because most people suffered from the double hop issue. And that was basically caused by using NTLM as your authentication mechanism in SharePoint, and your SQL Server being remote. So if that was your setup, then what you'd find is your token could only be passed from the browser that you were logged on as to IIS, and it couldn't make that second hop across to SQL. So everything used to work fantastically well in the development environment when you've got everything on the one VM or something like that. You used to be able to configure this using trusted authentication, and then you'd move to your production environment and it would fall down and you get the double hop issue. So there was a couple of ways around the double hop issue. One of them was to use the single sign-on authentication. Another one was to configure Kerberos instead of using NTLM, which wasn't always an option depending on whether your organization would want you to use Kerberos or not. So quite often you find yourself configuring single sign-on instead. However, if you do want to use trusted authentication, it can still be done via the connection string, which wasn't available initially in 2007, but it was fixed later on in one of the service packs. Prior to that, you still got an error. It basically said it didn't support trusted authentication. So that's one way where you can configure a connection. I'm going to show you some connections to relational databases shortly. So for this example, I'm going to connect to a different type of data source. We're going to go for an XML file. Just show you we can do that too. So what I have here on my desktop is just some customers coming across from Northwind. So I'm going to import that into my site, and you can see I've now got that saved as a data source in here. Now once I've got it configured as a data source, we obviously want to drop that onto our page as a web part. So I can open up my my web part page. Okay, and I can click inside the web part zone here, and you'll notice on the insert ribbon we've got the data view as one of those options, and there's my data source that's come available. So I can either click onto that and then configure it. So you can see it over on the right hand side here, we're able to configure it, and like I say, you've got full flexibility as to what you want to do here. It goes and grabs the first 5 or 6 columns from the data source, but what I can do is actually navigate through all of the records within that data source to preview what data I'm going to be bringing back before I sort of add those columns and everything to my grid. And you can come in and you can put nicer column names in and do whatever you want to do here. So I'm simply going to go and add city as one of my examples. And I'm going to clear out the value in that column and just simply drag and drop city into any of those rows, and you can see how easy it is, therefore, to sort of configure this how you want it to be displayed. A couple of other things we can do is also do some conditional formatting, and in sort of true SharePoint designer fashion, you simply just highlight what it is you want to apply the formatting to. So if you just want to apply the formatting to one column, then just simply highlight that column. If you want to apply the conditional formatting to the entire row, then you can highlight the entire row as well. And just simply right-clicking that allows me to then format this data how I want, or I can jump into the conditional formatting as I described. And that's a simple case of clicking onto the Create menu and then choosing Apply Formatting, and then you get to configure it with your conditions and the formatting options and so on. You can also show or hide content based on a condition. So anybody that's interested in creating some sort of KPI or simple KPI interface, you can do that with the data grid as well. You can simply just insert images in the grid using the traffic light indicators or something like that, and then hide the green icon based on a false condition and show the red icon based on a true condition and so on. So I'm going to just simply select Apply Formatting. Choose a column, so I'm going to go after city, if I can see it. There it is. And I'm just going to set that equal to, and type in the value New York. Okay, and then we can go to Set Style and configure that however we want. So I'll just give that a background color of red there, which tends to look nice with the blue in SharePoint. Okay, so I'm ready to save that. Refresh my page here in the browser. And there we go, we've connected to a data source and we're able to view it inside a web part very, very easily. Okay, so what are the downsides? Well, obviously you're giving people access to SharePoint Designer, which you may not want to do. You're also going to have a fairly good understanding of the back-end database and which tables to connect to and so on and so forth. And you're relying perhaps on information workers to configure things like the authentication, which they're not generally going to know that. So this might actually still be a job, even though you're not writing code or anything. It might still be a job for sort of a DBA or a developer that has that kind of understanding. Okay, but it's certainly one of the options available to us. And like I say, you can create some pretty good scenarios with this using webpack connections and so on. So moving on, let's talk about what else we've got. Like I said, there's some pros and also some cons, which I mentioned. So there's custom web part development. So you can create your own custom web part, which is obviously great. The thing about this is you often think of creating some simple code in ADO.NET or Link as being fairly straightforward, and it's not going to take a great deal of effort from a developer to create a solution. I know that many years ago as an MCT, I used to teach people ADO.NET all the time, and they were fascinated with 5 or 6 lines of code, and there we are, we're connected to a database, and we've got a table there, a query, and we've presented it on the page. It's all the other bits and pieces that we need to address. Obviously, all the exceptions that could occur. Are you going to allow people to filter the data? And again, are you going to build in things like conditional formatting or web part connections and so on? We have a tool that I'm going to show you. It's called the Data Viewer Web Part. It's not been designed for SharePoint 2010, but it happens to work, which is quite nice. Now, here it is. I'm just going to simply open up the tool pane and show you some of the sort of things that you may want to consider when you connect to a data source. So you may be writing this specifically for one data source, but what we've done here is allowed several data sources, so you can connect directly again to SQL or Oracle or Microsoft Access and so on. Again, we're going to provide that with a server name. We're offering different authentication methods. And then we've got the ability to do things like browse the databases that are available and simply build or choose a table and then build your view using this. So we can simply, again, pick and choose which columns we want to display. You can provide column aliases, etc., etc. And also provide the ability to edit or delete, which could be dangerous. So if you're going to be doing that as well, then you also need to take into account all of the validation and everything that's done on the back-end database. So I'm simply going to save that. You can see here there's filtering options and conditional formatting options and so on. Caching is something else that you need to consider because going and accessing data in SharePoint can be a slow thing depending on how many rows are in that table that you're accessing or stored procedure. And you could be holding up the entire web part page whilst your web part is going to go on display. So you may want to enable caching or certainly have that configured. I'm going to OK this and hope for the best. And yeah, there we go. We've got some data coming back to us as well. So let's have a look at the data available to us in there. This is the code for that. And you'll find that inside the web part, we've got about 2,000 lines of code. Just over 2,000 lines of code there. And then there's the tool part, which has about 4,000 lines of code to provide all the filtering options available to us and the conditional formatting and so on. And we've also got some JavaScript. So what we're doing there is allowing the web part to refresh itself without having to refresh the page all the time. So we've got not strictly Ajax, but we've got like a callback method using JavaScript that calls the server-side code, and that then allows us to refresh the page periodically and so on. And you'll find in there that I think there was in the region of 2,000 lines of code as well. Okay. Now the problem with that, if you're in here, you're probably familiar with ADO.NET or Link and so on, but we've got to support this. So if you're one of the developers that's written this application, you've got to support it for your environment. So as things move on, there's a good example here of there was a new Oracle driver that came out not so long ago, a 64-bit one, and so on, and this web part doesn't work with it. So we've got to go back to the code and try and address that issue and so on. So it's never ending. Once you've got the web part working, you're still going to come across other things that you need to fix. So that's really the only downside. The good thing is obviously you can write whatever you want as far as your code is concerned. Let's just make that full screen again, just bear with me. Okay, so custom web part development, like I said, people are familiar with ADO.NET. You've got full control over it. There's several technologies that you could use. Visual Studio is probably what you're going to use to do your server-side code, but then as far as actually presenting the data is concerned, you've got lots of choices now. So you could go down the Ajax route or Silverlight and also jQuery, which provide you some very useful scenarios for displaying the data. So some of the issues, something that starts off simple could become a nightmare. You've got to support it, you've got to evolve it. Your position may be changed within your organization, so somebody else then has to pick up all of that. And you've also got things like to consider, like web part connections. Are you going to be able to write back to the data source as well? Lots of things that people ask for are things like the ability to export that data to Excel and so on. So it's not just simply a case of connecting to ADO or through ADO.NET and presenting the data. So another option is BCS. Now, if you're familiar with the Business Data Catalog in SharePoint 2007, you're probably also familiar that it only came with MOS Enterprise, which was one of the downsides. You had to have the full-blown license of SharePoint in order to actually use the Business Data Catalog. The good news is that Business Connectivity Services actually comes with the equivalent of WSS now. We've got the my brain escapes me. Foundation Services. So you've got Foundation Services now that actually comes with BCS or some of BCS. You haven't got everything, but the one good thing that you do have is the external list, which is probably the most powerful part of the BCS, which is nice. So let's just talk about what BCS offers you now. It's not all just about displaying data within a web part like the other two solutions I showed you. So yeah, you could use a data viewer and display data in a grid, or you could use your own custom web part. This goes way beyond that. You've got the ability to actually search the line of business data through the SharePoint search interface. You've got the external data column. It used to be called the business data column in BDC. The external data column allows you to create a new column within a list or a library and configure that to point to your data source or what's known as an external content type now. And then you can use that data as a lookup when you're creating your documents. So let's say you're creating some proposals for all of your customers, and you want to organize the proposals by customer. Rather than simply typing in the customer name or something like that, you can actually look up the customer from the back-end database. And then you can create, again, all sorts of powerful solutions using web part connections. So you could simply have a document library with all these documents organized by customer, and then you could have a business connectivity services web part that's linked to that. So as you click onto each customer, then you're seeing all the relevant documents for that customer, and so on. We're also able to connect to user profiles. So we have user profiles pretty much everywhere in human resource databases, also things like Active Directory and Sage, etc. So what we can do is actually connect to that, bring the user profile into SharePoint, and then we can use your user profile for things like audience targeting and so on, which is, again, useful. You also have an object model. So if you do want to actually create some custom solutions, here's another consideration. So the a custom web part option, obviously you're doing exactly that. You're writing a custom web part for a specific problem. You could use BCS even if you didn't like the out-of-the-box web parts. If you still want to have your own web part offering your own functionality. It cuts out a whole load of code because you're already using BCS to actually configure the connection to the data source and handling all the authentication options and the exceptions and so on and so forth. All you really need to do here is specify which external content type you want to use and what filter you want to use, and then you've got the data back. So it's literally a few lines of code to implement some objects, connect to them, and then you can start doing with it what you wanted to do with it. Maybe tie it to an SP grid view or something along those lines. So there is an object model around BCS. You've also got the external list. So the business data catalog used to be just simply a read-only solution. Now we can write back to the data source as well via the external list. And validation is not really an issue either because you can actually use InfoPath for that. So you've got things like the new form to create new items inside the external list and an edit form. If you want to implement some validation, then you can simply use the validation controls that InfoPath offers you, configure those. You could write code if you wanted to within InfoPath and then save that back, and you've built yourself a pretty quick solution. You also have web parts. The web parts are pretty unchanged from the business data catalog, apart from the fact that they're AJAX solutions now. The external list really does the job of the web parts. So typically you wouldn't use those, and the web parts also aren't available to you in foundation services. That only comes with the Office server. One of the major improvements here is tooling. You actually have two options for connecting to your data source now. Prior to that, we used to either have to use a third-party tool, or you used to have to write lots of XML to connect to the data source. Now we can just use SharePoint Designer to connect quickly and easily to sources like SQL, or we can use Visual Studio.net, which provides us with a business data model. So again, you can sort of drag and drop the tables that you want to connect to and so on. You will have to write a little bit of code, but you've got the options available to you to connect to whatever source you want, and you're not writing as much code as you would do if you're starting from scratch in a web part. So let's have a quick look at BCS. I'm just going to drop these web parts off the page so we've got some room. And jump back into SharePoint Designer. And I want to refresh that for a minute. Okay, so what you have with SharePoint Designer is the ability to create a connection to a data source using this option, an external content type. This used to be called an entity in 2007. I'm going to go and create a new external content type, and I can give it a name. So I'm going to call that customers. I can set a display name and a programmatic name if need be. And I can also choose things like the office type. So this is, again, one of the extra things that you're not going to get with a simple web part solution. The Office type allows me to integrate better with Microsoft Office. So if I'm connecting to a number of customers or a number of contacts within a SQL Server database, I could actually mark the Office type as a contact. And that means that I'm able to connect to this data source also through things like Outlook, and they will just show as regular contacts using SharePoint almost as a hub to the back-end database. And again, if I set it as an appointment, then it would show up in my Outlook calendar and so on and so forth. So I'm going to use this as generic just for the time being. And I'm going to go and connect to the data source. It's remembered my connection from last time. So we can see there's the Northwind database. But if I did want to create a connection afresh, I just simply click onto Add Connection. And these are the things that I can connect to. So I can connect to what's known as the .NET shim, which is actually an assembly providing your connection to the data source now. So those of you with things like SAP, you can actually write an assembly that provides the connectivity to SAP, and then use SharePoint Designer to connect to that assembly. And you've also got the ability to do that via WCF Web Services as well. So I'm going to choose the option to configure a connection to SQL Server. And you can see here I just simply type in the SQL Server name, the database name, and again, you've got some authentication options. Slightly different authentication options. I can connect with the user's identity, which is basically the trusted authentication option again. You may suffer from the double hop issue depending on how this is configured again, whether you're using NTLM or Kerberos, etc. Or you can connect through impersonation with a custom identity, and that would use the sort of newer version of single sign-on called Secure Store services. There is another option as well that you don't get to see yet. So I'm just going to simply click onto OK to that. And again, there's my connection. And somehow I can modify that connection. I think it's on the next screen, which I'll show you. For now, what I'm going to do is just expand the tables, choose what it is I want to connect to. So I want to connect to customers. And I simply right-click that, and I can then go and create all my methods. So these are the methods that you'll be handwriting with XML back in the BDC. So I've got things like the read item operation. I've got the read list operation. So that's basically your finder or specific finder methods. I've also got the new create, update, and delete operations as well. Now, if I want to connect tables together, then I can go and create a new association between the two external content types. I'm just going to go ahead and create all the operations. And that launches this wizard where I can go through and configure them all. So I can, again, pick and choose which columns I want to display. I can specify identifiers, make columns read-only if I want to, or make sure that they're required, bits and pieces like that. I can also, if I specified that this was something like a contact office type, then I can also map the columns together. So I might have, for example, used surname instead of last name in my data source, so I can map the two. We also have something called a show-in picker, and that's when I'm using the business data column and actually want to select a value, rather than just showing me a list of customer IDs, which is not going to be useful to anybody. I can choose a column and say that I want to actually show that one in the picker as well. So now I'll see a customer ID and a company name, which is a bit more useful. I'm just going to hit finish at that point. You can see my methods get generated, and then I'm going to hit save. Okay, so that should be saved. And across here back in the browser, I'm now able to go and create a new external list. I could do that from SharePoint Designer as well if I wanted to. So when I click on to create a list, we should see in here somewhere an external list. There it is. So there's my external list. I'm just going to click on to create again. give it a name. And you can see here at the bottom I've got the external content type. So I'm able to browse those. And there's my customer's external content type that I created. Bless you. So I now get an access denied by business data connectivity, which I didn't count on. So let's see if we can sort out why that is. So this is where I can come in and change the authentication mode. I mentioned that there was one missing from before. There's one here called the BDC identity, which didn't show on the initial screen. And that's actually going to use the identifier account that the business data connectivity services is running with. That used to be like the application pool in 2007, but I'm going to set BDC identity. So whatever identity that is running with, I will now authenticate, or attempt to authenticate with. It looks like the demo gods are getting me. Let's just try that again. Okay, maybe simply I don't have permissions. Let's just go have a quick look. I should be connecting to this as administrator, so that's surprising, but okay, let me just wrap up by talking about it. So typically you wouldn't come across this issue, but what we would have here is a grid that looks very much like a web part. It's actually the same as a SharePoint list. You'll have your, like I say, the ability to do all the sorting and the filtering. Basically, everything you can do in a SharePoint list, you can do with this external list. So that means you can even create new views on the data, just like you would do with a SharePoint list as well. There's list settings in here. So through that, you can pick and choose which columns you want to display. You've also got all the form web parts. So there's the forms to display the data and also to edit the data and so on that you can customize, like I said, through InfoPath. And we've also got the ability to do things like connect to Outlook. So we're going to take that data, display it as contacts perhaps in Outlook. And you can also take the data offline using the SharePoint workspace. Something you couldn't do in the business data catalog. If you're going to be sat on a train for a couple of hours or something, you can actually take this data offline and then it will sync up later on during the day. So there's a few improvements over what we had before within SharePoint 2007. Now, as well as that, like I said, you've got the business data column. So if I jump into a document library, okay, so I can go and create a new column inside the document library. And this is our external data column option here. I doubt that's going to work if it didn't work for the external list, but let's give it a go anyway. So I'll just call that customer. look up from the customer's external content type again. And you can see this goes and grabs all the available columns from that external content type. So I store which column I want to store, or choose which column I want to store, which would be company name. And I also want to display things like the address, the city, fax and phone if you like, and add those to the view as well. Okay, so when I now go and add a new document, what we should be able to do, here we're getting access to denied again, here we should see a list of customers, so we can simply go and choose one of those customers and then associate that customer to the document. And again, that's where you're going to be able to go and create all your views and everything. Perhaps organize all your documents by customer or something like that, or by town or whatever. So that's, again, another useful feature of business connectivity services. And with this, you get you can see the columns that are created in my view as well. A copy of the data is made at that point. It's not actually linked back to the data source, but I can hit this refresh icon, and that will go and refresh all the external data as and when I need to. So performance reasons, it's not going to refresh on the fly just when you access a document library. Okay. So the pros of business connectivity services, it can be a no-code solution. As you see, you can use SharePoint Designer to connect to things like SQL Server. If you do want to connect to other data sources, then you are going to have to go down the Visual Studio route, and you will have to write some code or use a third-party tool. The good news is there's plenty of support for BCS, or there will be plenty of support for BCS, just like there is with the Business Data Catalog. So lots of people blog about it. There's forums and so on, which you're not going to have for your own custom web part. The tooling is vastly improved over what we had before. And then as far as customizing it goes, well, you can actually customize all of the web parts and the external list with InfoPath or SharePoint Designer. So all of the things like the conditional formatting and things like that, you can do that for this as well using SharePoint Designer, which is a nice thing. You've also got the ability to security trim the data. So although we might be connecting as one particular user, if we use the user identity option, you can trim it by saying which SharePoint users are allowed to view that data via SharePoint. So this is really useful for things like Microsoft CRM, where most of the security trimming for Microsoft CRM is done in the front end and not actually the back end database. So you can sort of reinvent the wheel with that and specify which SharePoint users are allowed to see your line of business data inside SharePoint. You've obviously got the integration with Office, offline connectivity, and all of your data is cached. Again, just like the data viewer web part. And some of this we mentioned, so the different types of connections you've got. You've got the ability to connect to lots of different data sources, but only really SQL without any coding. So anything else, you'd either have to create an assembly for your .NET Shim, develop a WCF web service, or connect directly to a data source, such as Oracle, by writing code. So there is a bit of a downside if you are having to go and write the code yourself. Also requires a good understanding of the business connectivity services object model if you do want to create some custom solutions. So if you are familiar with ADO.NET, it might be that that's the better route for you to create a simple solution, as opposed to sort of learning the BCS object model and then creating your solution with that. So the last slide, reporting services. I saw a demonstration, and Paul Cumsey has this on his blog site as well. I'm sure if you just Google Paul Cumsey, you'll come across that. And he used simply reporting services along with a custom web part with very little code to display a report. So that's really just another option that's available to you. If you do use reporting services, you could interface that as well using SharePoint. So yeah, Paul Cumsey was going to come across from Australia, but like I say, he's not here, unfortunately. So they're the 4 methods. I'm going to sort of open up to any questions that you may have. I'll cut the first part. So if you use WCF or store procedures, what are the implications for what, sorry? Okay, so you would have to go down the Visual Studio route and configure those methods, basically. So what you saw me do in SharePoint Designer, where I created the read operation, the update, delete, and insert, you'd have to write those yourself. So, yeah, that's the only option available to you. Yeah,
how easy to deploy this test connection to server?
So how easy is it to
Deploy this test connection when we set up in SharePoint Designer? How can we deploy it?
Oh, okay. So how easy is it to deploy the connection using BCS? Well, you don't really deploy it. When you install SharePoint, you create your web application and so on, and then you can start the services for that web application, and BCS is one of those. And at the point where that service is started, you actually get a database sat alongside the content database for that web application, which is the metadata store. And that's where everything is being written directly to. So when you configure the connection using SharePoint Designer, as soon as you hit save, it's written to that database. Okay. Okay, I'll see where you're going with the question. So you try it in staging. Yeah, you basically have to. Yeah, I guess unless the content deployment, I guess would also deploy that. But yeah, I'm not sure whether content deployment would do the job for you or not. But otherwise, it'd be a case of configuring it again. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Good question. Okay.
And one more thing. Is it possible to run a workflow on this business connector, like external data column? Because when we change anything from database, it does not actually see a change in SharePoint list.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we execute this? Is it possible to execute any workflows which will find it in a SharePoint?
Okay, again, a very good question. So can you use workflows with the with business connectivity services? As far as the external list is concerned, the workflow doesn't work in the same way that it does for any other SharePoint list. There are a few things that are unavailable. So things like, workflow's not covered, and there's a couple of other things that will come to me in just a moment. But you could actually have a workflow that is triggered by a business data column, the external data column. That's one of the things that we've actually written a solution for the business data catalog book. So yeah, you could use SharePoint Designer workflows, or you can use Visual Studio workflows. I know also you may want to speak to Nintex, because Nintex have a solution that specifically works with business connectivity services as well. So that's another option for you.
Could you write a web part and connect it to this, and then you know the amount that signage using BCS?
Again, a very good question, and the answer is yes. So can you create a web part that connects to an external list? The external list actually uses the same object, SP list, as all the other lists. So yeah, you can iterate through the items like you would do with any other list and display them. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So one more question over here.
In terms of query performance, if you were to expose an external list, would you have better performance doing custom query with the database and BCS, or just using SP query on the SP list?
I would guess the BCS option, because they've actually, there was a lot of complaints about performance with the business data catalog, and they have done a lot more work with the caching and everything to really improve the business connectivity services performances. So I would hazard a guess that that's going to be the better option. Yeah, certainly. Okay, I guess it's pretty much time to wrap up. So thank you very much for coming. If you have any other questions. Okay. Thanks.